Coming up, the 2023 fire season brought destruction across the planet, with some of the fiercest blazes happening in Canada, Greece, Spain, and Hawaii.
We've seen large fires happen on every island.
A record 23 natural disasters and tens of billions of dollars in damages, the US counts the costs of a range of climate catastrophes.
At the current pace in 2023, we're looking at a billion disaster every 9 days.
But first, a storm resembling a hurricane barrels through the Mediterranean and with it claims thousands of lives. This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World. Well, it was nothing short of a nightmare for many people as Storm Daniel hit parts of Turkey, Greece and Bulgaria in early September. Nearly 24 people lost their lives in floods. The storm then traveled across the Mediterranean basin and slammed into Libya in northern Africa. The Medicane, which is a term given to tropical cyclone-like systems in the Mediterranean, caused flooding the likes of which many have never seen, bursting two dams that protected the coastal city of Derna. It was there neighborhoods, buildings, and homes were swept away like paper cards. The scientists say Daniel was supercharged by warm waters in the region. Thousands were killed in the deluge of floodwaters. The wildfires have swept through around half a square kilometer of forest and peatland on Indonesia's Sumatra island. Blazes like this right here are a yearly problem for Indonesia, particularly during the dry season. The situation this year was complicated as water sources weren't near the burn sites and several reservoirs were dry. The smoke reached as far as Singapore, Malaysia and southern Thailand. And staying in Indonesia, the Swiss-born monitor IQ Air says Jakarta experienced the worst air pollution in the world for multiple days in August. Air pollution is not a new problem for the capital, but the effects have been worse than ever this year, according to observers and activists. And doctors say respiratory diseases and pneumonia cases spiked 20 to 30% between March and July. The air pollution is caused by coal power plants and local topography and wind patterns that concentrate pollutants in certain areas.
Anak-anak kan termasuk salah satu kelompok yang rentan ya Mbak terhadap polusi udara. Yang mereka alami, mereka mudah terjadi ISPA, mudah jadi risiko asmanya, kemudian berkaitan dengan ISPA berulang akan menurunkan daya tahan tubuh, termasuk mengganggu pertumbuhan parunya, mengganggu fungsi paru, dan itu nantinya kalau berlangsung terus dan tidak bisa ditangani pada saat dewasa tentu perkembangan parunya akan terganggu.
Dan ketika jalanan padat, otomatis arus lalu lintas juga tidak berjalan lancar, sehingga akhirnya polusi udara itu timbul, baik dari asap kendaraan maupun
Kementerian LHK terkait dengan penegakan hukum terhadap sumber-sumber pencemaran, terutama dari industri, pembangkit listrik dan lain-lain, dan juga uji untuk emisi kendaraan yang harus ketat.
And wildfires razed the Hawaiian town of Lahaina on the island of Maui in August, devastating the community and killing more than 100 people. Toxic debris was left behind, which experts say could take almost a year to clean up. And while locals work to recover, many in Hawaii and around the world are worried about the increasing risk of wildfires and the destruction they cause. And they're looking into what causes them and what can be done to prevent the next one. Clay Traunicht from the University of Hawaii specializes in environmental management and tropical agriculture and talks about the conditions for the Hawaii flames, as well as what can be done to prepare for future ones.
The first thing that people really think about during these incidents is the time at the fire occurred, what was the weather like, and this is really what we talk about, specifically fire weather. And we had a pretty dangerous combination at the time of very high winds and low humidity. And so this, I think it's pretty intuitive what those conditions can do for fire behavior. So this creates very explosive fire growth, fast spread, high intensity. It creates incredibly difficult conditions for suppressing and containing these fires, and also increases the extent of the damage that they cause on the landscape. There's some debate actually whether or not the degree to which it was influenced by the hurricane passing to the south versus actually some a high pressure ridge to the north. But what we have seen over the past couple of years, starting to pay attention to, is as when these storm systems pass close enough to affect our weather, but not quite close enough to deliver precipitation, what we've been seeing is an increase in wind speed, which is obviously drives the speed of fires across the landscape at faster rates, but also these storm systems draw moisture towards them. And that what that does, creating drier conditions, is the fuels that are out there, all the vegetation that's there burns more explosively, hotter, and so it creates, again, much more dangerous conditions. But fires like this are not unprecedented. We've seen large fires happen on every island. All the main Hawaiian Islands have experienced fires in the realm of this size and in these similar kinds of conditions. And what we know from that is that they are extremely difficult for firefighters to contend with, given the limited investment in these pre-suppression actions or these preventative measures and mitigation measures. And so what we've been trying to communicate this whole time is that this is not outside of our control. The climatic or weather conditions, there's not a lot we can do about that, but we can take measures long ahead of the fires when they occur that can reduce risk and prevent the extent of the fires, the intensity of the fires, and just limit the impacts we've been seeing long before these fires occur, to make conditions safer for the communities, make conditions safer for our firefighters. And this includes like general preparedness, increasing access to water and ingress, egress. In other words, like, can people get in and out of communities? Can firefighters get in and out of these communities? So there's things about the built environment that we can be improving. And then, of course, going back to the fuels, what can we be doing on the landscape? How can we be better caring for this landscape to reduce the risk of these in the future? And that can be ranging from sort of conventional methods like fuel breaks, where you're doing these linear mowing and spraying to try to reduce the continuity of grasslands, all the way up through just alternative forms of agriculture, traditional agriculture, as well as reforestation, ecological restoration, converting these fuels to something that's much less likely to burn, and that, you know, puts us less at the mercy of these weather events, which are guaranteed to happen again in the future.
A new report entitled Planet Wreckers: How 20 Countries' Oil and Gas Extraction Plans Risk Locking in Climate Chaos talks about just that. The research, written up by Romain Ilalalen and Kelly Trout, reveals the startling impact a handful of powerful countries would have on global warming if they went ahead with planned oil and gas projects. The equivalent lifetime pollution of about 1,100 new coal plants would be released if these projects proceeded, making it impossible to keep global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So which countries are mentioned in the study? Well, one of the report's authors, Romain Ilalalen, is here on Just 2 Degrees to discuss this. He is Global Policy Lead at Oil Change International. That's an organization that says it works to expose the true cost of fossil fuels. Hi there, Romain. It's great seeing you. What a fascinating report. First, I'd just love to figure out, or find out rather, why was this report commissioned? What did you guys set out to find out?
Well, thanks for having me. The idea behind this report is simple. Next week in New York City, the UN Secretary General will convene a climate summit in which he invited countries to announce energy transition plans to limit global warming. And one of these plans need to include plans to phase out fossil fuels and to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. And so we wanted to look at what countries are actually doing and whether they're getting ready to align with what the UN Secretary General has been asking them to do, which is to end new oil and gas projects, because we've known for years, and science has shown that repeatedly, that new oil and gas is incompatible with a safe climate for all. So that's why we wanted to look at actually what countries around the world are preparing and what they're doing in terms of approving new fossil fuel projects. All
right, so your report says 20 countries, or as your report calls them, planet wreckers. They would be responsible for nearly 90% of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by new oil and gas projects over the next 27 years by the time we reach 2050. The US is at the top of your list. Why?
Well, the US is already the largest producer of fossil fuels in the world, actually, of oil and gas in particular. 1 out of 5 barrels of oil and gas produced in the world already comes from the United States. And the reality is that despite the claims of climate leadership from the Biden administration, and we've heard a lot of that over the past few years, the reality is that the US has no plans to control the amount of fossil fuels it's going to produce. And a lot of that comes from the fracking industry, but it's also coming from a lot of infrastructure projects that have been supported and incentivized by the US administration, pipelines and export terminals, etc. So on the one hand, you have a country that claims to be a climate leader that is doing a lot of work to promote renewable energy at home in particular. But on the other hand, it's also a country that has no plan to limit the amount of fossil fuels it's going to produce, and therefore the amount of CO2 it's going to burn or export through the oil and gas it's going to produce. So there's a real discrepancy here between the words and the actions. But the United States is by far the worst player in this field, but they're not the only one. What our report shows is that there's a group of 5 countries actually that are rich, diversified, that do not rely on fossil fuel revenues to fund their economy. And these countries are the US, obviously, but also the UK, Canada, Australia, and Norway. And these countries collectively amount for the majority of new oil and gas projects that we know are not compatible with a safe climate. So yeah, it is about time that these rich countries that bear a very large responsibility for the climate crisis stop making things worse and stop adding fuel to the fire and announce that they will stop approving new oil and gas projects.
Yeah, it does appear quite hypocritical. Although the US is one of those top wealthy countries that keep talking about, they're very excited about the idea of carbon capture, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Do you think they use this excuse to continue burning oil and gas?
Absolutely. Not just the United States, actually. All oil and gas producing countries have supported quite actively carbon capture or other forms of techno fixes to the climate crisis. And this has been used very clearly as a ploy to slow down the inevitable transition away from fossil fuels. And if you look at what the oil and gas industry itself is saying, they really see these technologies as their lifelines, because they would theoretically allow them to continue producing while reducing emissions. The reality is that these technologies are unproven, dangerous, and the question that we should be asking governments and the oil and gas industry is, are we ready to bet our collective future and a safe climate for all on the deployment of technologies that have failed again and again at reducing emissions, and that are expensive, unreliable, and that only seem to serve the interests of the oil and gas industry?
Interesting. The US has been spending a lot of energy trying to get China to reduce their carbon emissions. Where does China place on your list, and why?
So China is a significant producer of fossil gas in particular. They're not a significant exporter. They use a lot of it for their domestic market and their industry. They're also a significant producer of coal, and that's also feeding into their domestic industry. China is interesting. It's a country that is investing massively in renewable energy, more so than any other country in the world, actually. But it's also a country that is adding on top of its renewable energy a lot of fossil fuel capacity. And so that's why its emissions are not going down despite the massive strides it's made in deploying clean energy. And so what this China story shows us, in fact, is that you can't just say we are going to deploy renewable energy on a massive scale and fossil fuels are going to disappear, because it doesn't work like that. In fact, so far, all the renewable energy that we've seen deployed around the world, and that's great, and we need more of it, but it's been on top of fossil fuels. You know what I mean? So what we need is displacement. What we need is to make sure that we have a trajectory to reduce the production and the use of fossil fuels while scaling up renewable energy. Otherwise, we're just going to add energies on top of each other, and the global CO2 emissions are not going to go down.
All right, it was quite interesting speaking with you. And of course, the report is quite interesting to read. Romain Iwalalen, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Well, water levels on one of Europe's oldest lakes, Lake Prespa, are now less than 8 meters below what they were in the 1970s. The lake is home to more than 2,000 species of birds, fish, mammals, and plants. Last year, NASA reported that satellite images showed the lake lost 7% of its surface area and half of its volume between the years 1984 and 2020. Environmentalists partly blame irrigation for farmland by bordering countries. The UN warns that some of the wildlife in the area are at risk of extinction from loss of habitat, from erosion, untreated waste, and harmful farming practices, including the use of harsh pesticides that end up in the water.
I grew up in this village, and we all came to like to jump from this platform in the water. In 2018, we jumped a lot from it. We played with balls and everything, but now you can look, the situation isn't very good. The water went away.
И сега за 2 месеци се повлечено е во висина 36 сантими. А може да се овие 2-3 дена уште 2-3 сантими уште намалено. Тоа е. И уште ќе намали. Нема дожд, нема и зима нема, ни снег има ништо нема. Нема река, една река има само во езерото. Нема дотурна вода и нема. Тоа е катастрофа, природна катастрофа.
Lake Prespa has gone down and up many times in the geological history, and it has survived. A lot of animals, a lot of biodiversity has survived. What is unique now is that we are contributing to this effect of climate change, and also that now the lake is going away, or it is decreasing its water level, but we, the people who are living around there, we do not know how to cope with this because we have gotten used to the lake as it was, especially in the 60s and 70s when it was much higher, maybe up to 8 meters higher than what we see now.
The Red Cross Disaster Relief Agency has announced it's launching a $1 billion effort in response to the increasing impacts of climate change in the United States. And so far this year, the country has seen a record 23 natural disasters, and each one done more than $1 billion in damages, according to the U.S. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. The total in damages for all 23 is nearly $58 billion, not including Hurricane Idalia, Hurricane Hillary, and Midwestern drought damages. The money for the fund comes from large donors and individual donations. The White House has also asked lawmakers to boost disaster relief funding from $12 billion to $16 billion. Experts say damages are set to rise as billion-dollar disasters become more and more common.
You know, at the current pace in 2023, we're looking at a billion disaster every 9 days. So almost weekly, we're seeing a major event strike the country. And that doesn't even account for the hundreds of other events we're seeing that are impacting communities every day that are also climate driven. They just don't get to the scale that we see in those larger billion-dollar events. So making sure, you know, Red Cross will be an extreme advocate for those communities and the families to make sure their loss is at the top of that list on how we invest and how we direct those resources that we can. So it's a bigger part of the conversation. I've been doing this work now for almost 18 years at the Red Cross. And when I joined the Red Cross, right after Hurricane Katrina, there were definitely seasons in the work. There would be hurricane season, then we'd have a bit of a break in the fall and early winter. You'd have a few winter storms, but it'd be a slowdown period. We'd see tornado season in the spring. You'd have a few floods in the early summer, but there would be these breaks between these types of events that you could rebuild capacity, rebuild energy. Volunteers that were deployed could come back home. And we don't have a break anymore. It is constant. It is, right now today, we are moving resources around the East Coast for Hurricane Lee. At the same time, we have over 2,000 volunteers on the ground in Hawaii, in Florida, in Georgia, North and South Carolina, responding to the disasters that have already happened. And we're at a pace that we normally don't see this time of year of deployments. And more of those volunteers are deploying not once or twice, but 3 or 4 times to different disasters around the country.
Thousands of indigenous women from all over Brazil have been protesting regularly in the capital, Brasilia, for the return of their ancestral territories. There's a land case being heard in the Supreme Court, specifically against what's known as the time frame argument. If the judges approve the law attached to the case, Native people will lose the right to land they did not live on in 1988. Many indigenous Brazilians say that violates their rights, as they were often pushed off ancestral lands, including by the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil in the 80s. The case has suffered several delays as the judges deliberate.
Está em tudo, né? Porque a gente estamos com a terra em processo de demarcação, que ainda não foi demarcada, porém a gente está nessa luta, e se o marco temporal vir agora, a gente estamos meio enrolado, nem somente eu, mas todos os povos que estão aqui, estamos nessa luta, né? A gente diz não ao marco temporal.
Que está querendo destruir a nossa terra, querendo acabar a nossos territórios, a nossa natureza.
A holística e essa visão da sustentabilidade, a relação com a terra e com os recursos naturais, faz com que as mulheres indígenas sejam muito espertas no sentido de sabedoria, de apontar soluções para as diversas crises que nós vivemos. Seja ela a crise climática do planeta todo, mas seja ela nas questões humanitárias que os povos indígenas passam.
Louis Pugh, the first United Nations patron of the oceans, completed a 500-kilometer swim in the Hudson River to raise awareness about the importance of river health. He kicked off his journey on August 13th in a pond considered the source of the Hudson River. Louis stressed that his swim down the Hudson wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago as it was polluted. The river was famous for being polluted by industrial chemicals, old tires and sewer runoff. Long-run cleanup efforts made the river a playground for kayaks and sailboats.
50 years ago, the Hudson was one of the most polluted rivers in the whole world. And a swim like this would have been absolutely impossible. But then in the 1970s, New Yorkers said enough is enough. And you started cleaning up this river. And you started mile by mile and town by town and one factory after the next. And you turned the fate of this river around and that of the wildlife that call it home.
What have been the big highlights? Well, the wildlife at the source. Wow, beavers and vultures and ospreys and bald eagles, and to swim down the river and then occasionally go into backstroke and watch a bald eagle just flying above me and just following me down the river, such a highlight.
This is the one river in the whole world which can send a message of hope to everybody that your river, whether it be in Britain, whether it be in France, India, China, that your river can one day be saved, that it can be cleaned up.
We cannot have a healthy planet without healthy rivers. And so, the work really starts now. It was an arduous swim, a long swim, but now I feel really motivated by what's happened here. And next week it's straight into the United Nations, and that's my message. Please, we need to invest. We need to take care of rivers. If people in New York can do this with their rivers, I'll be saying to the delegates who are meeting in the United Nations, if the people of New York can do this with their rivers, surely everyone else can also do it.
A new study says that the world has now crossed 6 of 9 planetary boundaries. The Stockholm Resilience Centre's research indicates that deforestation, biomass overuse, and extinction rates are all rising. Scientists say crossing environmental boundaries can lead to irreversible changes that pose a risk to both people and ecosystems. Only 3 of the 9 boundaries assessed are still within safe limits, which are ocean acidification, ozone depletion, and airborne pollution.
This is a health check. It is really assessing how are we doing with regards to the sustainability of the planet, the livability on Earth. 6 of the 9 boundaries are outside of their safe space. The 4 boundaries that we assessed in 2015 are deeper into the red, so we're continuing to move in the wrong direction. And this is a big concern. Not only are we not acting on the scientific evidence we have, on many of these boundaries, we have global frameworks. We have a Paris Agreement. We have a biodiversity agreement. We've had summits on fresh water. We recognize the risks we take with chemical overloading and air pollutants. So it's not as if we're sitting in the dark and then suddenly pops up this planetary boundary analysis. So it is a real concern. This research that we now publish adds, I think, is this, the the necessity of really solving problems across all the Earth systems.
That is our show, but before we go, here are images from the southern Brazilian city of Muchum after a cyclone dropped torrential rain and destroyed homes. The flooding left dozens of people dead.